Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. Welcome back. This is Jim Cunningham with Faith Influencer. We're talking about blended families, and actually we're following up from last podcast where we were talking about favoritism. So we're going to dive into this again, and as promised, I'm going to give you some of the fixes that I've experienced in my own journey in a blended family. I'll remind you, we're 15 years into our blended family, so thank the Lord we have overcome the statistic out there that says 70% of blended families are going to end in divorce. As a matter of fact, I was reading the other day, and this one surprised me, that of all the marriages in the United States, just a little less than half are blended families. So to say it another way, almost half of the families in the United States are blended families. So this is a real deal that we are addressing, and there are so many different issues. And what I'm hoping, and this is some of the feedback that I've gotten, and thank you again for feedback. I'm going to encourage you to keep doing that. But some of the feedback that I've gotten is that the issues that we're walking through are so real in your blended family that this has allowed you to bring it up to conversation because you and your spouse are listening to these podcasts. And now you're having some real conversation because we're talking about it. It's in the air. So let's talk about favoritism part 2, if you would, but I've got to begin here. I've got to remind you of something that we tend to forget about in a blended family. It's one of the reasons why they don't survive. I always say that the number one reason that blended families fail is because of issues with the children. I'm going to say maybe that's still true, but if it weren't true, it would be because this one takes precedence. And I'm going to call it the number one law of marriage. Now, hear what I'm saying, because this is becoming more of an awareness when I talk to other families, is that blended families, if anyone's going to have a tendency not to think about their marriage, it's going to be the blended family. But the survival of a blended family only happens when you understand the number one law, not of blended families, the number one law of marriage. Let me describe what I'm talking about. Marriage has the same position in a blended family as in a traditional family. It comes first. Under God, it comes first. What I mean by that is that the marriage in your second marriage still takes precedent over the children. That's not the tendency of blended families. The tendency of blended families is to reverse the order. I'm going to remind you, I want to read this passage to you. I want to remind you of the order. Listen to this. This is Genesis 2, and this is where God established this order in a blended family. And he said, "Then the Lord made woman from the rib, from man's rib he'd taken out of his side, brought her to man. And then man said, 'This is bone of my bone.'" By the way, I got to say this. Do you know in some translations when it says that God created woman from the side of man and he brought her to man, that man's first response, that you can read this in the Message, that Adam's response was, "Whoa." I love that translation. Adam had been asking for something besides the trees and the animals, and God finally gave him a wife. And when Adam saw her, another translation, Adam said, "That's it. That's what I've been missing." I like that translation. So he brought her to man, and Adam said, "This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman. She was taken out of man." Now listen to this, because I don't know why we tend to think that this is true in first marriages only, but if you want to have a successful blended family, this has to be true in this marriage. Listen to what he says. That is why a man leaves his father and his mother, and he unites to his wife, and they become one flesh. Do you get God's order of a family? The husband-wife relationship comes first. In a blended family, it comes first. Now, I'm going to say something that's going to sound a little out of place for you. One is that the same rules apply to your second marriage as they did to your first marriage as far as the marriage is concerned. The marriage still takes precedence. Your spouse, husband, your wife still comes first, not the children. Wife, your husband takes precedence over your children. Let me just say it this way. Don't give up your marriage for the kids. That's what's happening. Why do 70% of blended families end in divorce? Mostly because they give it up for the kids. Why? Because kids are just a temporary assignment. They're not with you forever. They're entrusted to you for a short time, and then they move on. And when they move on, they move on. Think about this. Your 25-year-old child, your 30-year-old child, they're out there now doing their own life. They don't want you around anymore. They don't want you in their business anymore. They had no problem at all moving on. So why would you give up your marriage for this temporary assignment that one day is just going to move on and do their own thing? So don't give up everything because of the children. God's order of marriage first, husband and wife relationship first, still takes precedence in the family. But now here's the tendency. And tell me if this is true or not, even though I already know it is. Blended families tend to gravitate toward the children. Lots of reasons why. One of the big ones is guilt. You feel guilty because your children went through a divorce. I said before, children are resilient and they bounce back. I experienced tremendous guilt. That perhaps was the biggest thing I had to overcome in my own life was forgiving myself for going through that, or my children having to go through that. So what happens is that parents, for all these reasons, tend to gravitate toward the children. But when you do that, and I know we all do, but I'm just making you aware of it. When we do that, then we disrupt God's order for the family. So that's what's happening. And then not only do parents tend to gravitate towards the children, but let me define that a little closer. Parents tend to gravitate toward their child or children. So we enter into this subject of what I'm going to call blend bias. It's the biases in a blended family. So here we come, blending our family. We bring in baggage. Hopefully we're unpacking that. I've encouraged everyone, be sure to go to counseling with someone who's experienced with blended families like I did with Lanny. You're going to unpack some of that baggage. Then you're going to put this household together. It doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect, because it's going to be far from it. There are going to be issues with kids. I said to you last time that you see it in the Bible as well. I mentioned to you the story of Joseph. And again, that blows my mind that Joseph, that his dad had 12 children with 4 wives. Can you imagine each of his 4 wives trying to pull for their biological child? Can you imagine what kind of household that created? And then the dad pulled for Joseph. Can you imagine that? No wonder all the other siblings sold Joseph, trying to get rid of him. But that's the blend bias that happens in biblical families, that happens in our families. Let me give you a definition of favoritism here, just so we're on the same level ground here. It's showing preferential treatment or partiality or more attention or different expectations with your child versus your stepchildren. Again, every blended family gets this. You're all walking through this. And here are the mistakes that we have to fix. One, prioritizing our biological child over our stepchild in terms of the attention that we give them. Got to fix that. I mentioned that last time. Got to fix that. Can't show more support to your child than you do your biological child. So let me address something, because this is true. I experienced it as well. You're going to feel that. You're going to feel closer to your biological child. I said to you in the beginning that you will love your child more than you love your stepchildren. Some people want to give me pushback on that, but I'm telling you, that is a natural feeling that you have for your biological child. There's just a biological connection. I didn't say you don't love your stepchildren. You do. You can love them greatly and create this amazing family. But I'm going to say to you that you're going to love your child most. But in that scenario, you have to intentionally, now listen to our vocabulary here. You have to intentionally create a structure in your family where you're not showing more attention to your child versus their children. You just have to be aware of it. You're going to feel it. I'm going to say you can't help that you feel that towards your child more than their children, but you intentionally cannot allow your family to go that direction. That's one mistake that you have to make sure that you fix. Here's the next one. Treating stepchildren differently when it comes to rules and when it comes to discipline. You can't treat them differently. So how do you not treat them differently? Listen, mom and dad, listen, husband and wife. Who makes the guidelines for your family? You do. Not your children. Not his children, not her children. You do, as a husband and wife. So what do? You come together. We've already talked about this, but let me remind you, you come together. You set the guidelines for your family. You set the non-negotiables. You set what's going to be so of every child in this house. You have to lay that out. And then you have to treat everybody the same when it comes to rules and discipline. Can't treat them differently. I told you last time that I was guilty of this, that I told my stepson to pick up his backpack and I picked up my own son's backpack. You can't do that. You've got to fix that. Again, intentional. And then here's the next thing. Don't dismiss feelings of favoritism. So here's what happened to me. My wife treated this so well. So when I was in the beginning, still having some guilt issues and still wanting to love on my children more than my wife's children, still wanting to spend more time with my children than her children, still singling out my children over her children, this is how she handled it. She pulled me aside in confidence. There's number one. Don't ever have this conversation in front of the children. Never have it in front of the children. She pulled me aside. They had no idea. It wasn't like she called me out in front of all of them and said, get to the room, we're going to talk. It wasn't, I was under discipline. No, she pulled me aside. Kids had no idea when, where, that it even happened. And she said, I want to bring something to your attention that I'm feeling. She did it intentionally. She was forward, but her tone wasn't elevated. She was kind. She was bringing it to my attention. I don't know if you realize, this is what she said. I don't know if you realize you're doing this or not, but you are intentionally spending a lot more time with your son than with my children, and they're starting to notice it. So I'm just requesting of you to think about that. Well, she handled that perfectly. And that brought an awareness to me that maybe subconsciously I knew, but this brought it out in the open, and it allowed me to fix that in my life because she handled it so well. My response was not to defend myself. Now that's often going to be your response. It's going to be to defend yourself. It's going to be it's like, no, I'm not. No, don't dismiss. If she's feeling that or if he's feeling that, do not dismiss their feelings. They're feeling that for a reason. Listen to what they're saying and don't become defensive. We're trying to create this family that God intends. So that's how we address that. That's how we fix that. All right. I've been dreading this one, but here it is. Here's the next mistake we have to fix. Do not allow outside interference. This is so big. Two areas that I see this. I'm going to share with you a story that a couple was sitting down with me, and that the wife handled it. In this case, she handled it so well. I have to tell you this story. So here's what was happening. Here is a husband and wife. They went through counseling. They were creating this blended family. So they decided that they were going to have their own house. They bought a house big enough for all of their children, and they were painting the inside of the house, and they were getting all of the rooms ready. And in this scenario, there were 4 children, 2 and 2. And this wife, her mother was involved. She volunteered to come over and help clean up and get the house ready. To paint, to clean windows. She jumped right in and helped. All of that was good. That was fine. But then she said to her daughter about her grandchildren, she whispered to her, when you divide up these bedrooms, you stand up for your kids. That's what she said. That's what the mother said, or the mother-in-law said. And I was sort of shocked that it was so brazen from the mother. I asked the wife, I said, so what did you say to your mother? And her response was so classic. This is what she said. She said, I looked at my mother and I said, Mom, they're all my kids. I thought, wow, that's perfect. That was such a good response. But I want to ask you a question. I'm sitting there with a husband and wife, and they're telling me this story. I'm blown away by the wife's response because it was so good that she just set the boundary right at the beginning. Mom, they're all my kids. This is our family. You're not butting in. But I want to ask you this. How do you think that made her new husband feel when he heard his wife say that? Defend their family as one family. How do you think it made him feel? You know how it made him feel. Not only was he so proud of his wife and her response, but that created a closeness and a bond. You can't let outside interference happen. Well, there's one other. I'm going to just mention this briefly because we're going to actually have an entire podcast on this subject, but it's the dreaded ex. It's the ex-husband or the ex-wife. So much interference happens by way of the ex. They try to get involved by way of their children or by way of their ex-spouse. You have to set boundaries and shut that down in the beginning. Like I said, we're going to have a whole podcast on how to deal with the ex. Maybe that's the most requested thing I've received so far. How do we deal with the ex? So we're going to talk about that. But just right now, understand outside interference, be bold and brazen and set boundaries and let people know they're not interfering with your family. Well, let me throw this last thing in. Because it was brought up to me, and I'm going to say in a legal manner, what happens if your family, when you're pulling your assets, all of your assets together as a family, you've got her assets, his assets, maybe he has a 401k, or she has a 401k, maybe they have properties. Maybe they have other assets. Maybe they have inheritance. how do you deal with that? Because there are some parents who feel this way. There are some step parents, and I say this smiling because I know you already know this. There are some step parents who do not like their stepchildren. They just don't like them. They're like, if it's up to me, if something happens to me and your mom, you're not getting anything. That's how they feel. So people ask about that. How do we handle that financial piece with our assets and our money? Well, there's a legal way to do that. If a husband says, I so dislike my stepchildren that if my wife passed away first, they're out. They're not getting anything. Here's what you do. You just create a will. Better than a will, you create a trust. You create a trust. You and your spouse come together and you come to an agreement. There may be something, I'm going to say like an inheritance. There may be, let's just say the wife. Let's say her parents passed away and they left her an inheritance for her children. That may be outside of the trust because that may already be designated for her biological children. That's not going to be shared with everyone. That's okay. That happens sometimes. That's not a problem. But when it comes to the husband and wife, their personal assets, and you've blended this family, you can sit down and agree, sit down with a lawyer, an estate planning attorney, sit down with the attorney, and you draw out the papers as to exactly how, if you were driving in a car together, the husband and the wife, and you were killed in a car wreck, what happens to everything? Well, if you don't do something, there's going to be a big fight. That's what's going to happen. So sit down, do it pretty soon, and create this trust, how you want everything to be divided out evenly and fairly. Now, why is that important? Well, some people have this idea, oh no, everything is so great in our family, we don't even have to address that. It's all going to work out fine. No, that's not what happens. It doesn't happen in with just biological children. They fight with each other. Even more so with blended families. So take this stress and this source of potential conflict off the table. Handle it now, put it all in a trust, divide it out how you want to divide it out. It's between you, the husband and the wife. It's not the children who are making this decision. It's the husband and the wife, and you settle it right at the beginning. So this is the idea of favoritism. These are some of the things that we have to fix. So I'm going to encourage you to follow these steps, begin fixing these things now. Let me ask you this again. What is the biggest challenge in your blended family? Send me that. You see the email below? Send me that. Ask me the question. I want to make sure that we do not overlook what your greatest need is. So I'm looking forward to receiving that. Thank you for joining us again. This is Jim Cunningham with Faith Influencer.